Buddhists don't talk a great deal about imagination. Imagination is often thought of as more problematic than anything else. Images and ideas and thoughts and words that get in the way of the clarity of pure mindful attention and awareness. Particularly in meditative circles, there's suspicion of thinking and having ideas, or at least when you're meditating. The danger with that approach is that it tends to sideline and marginalize the whole idea of imagination having a potentially positive, contributive role to the practice of the Eightfold Path and necessarily, therefore, the practice of the Dharma itself. The Pali or Sanskrit word ditthi, which is usually translated as view. So the Eightfold Path begins with right view, and then it goes on to right intention, and so on. I find perspective to be a more useful term here than view, because view suggests very much holding a view about something. And in many Buddhist traditions, those views will essentially be accepting the basic doctrinal tenets of that school of Buddhism. So when I trained as a Gelugpa monk, then right view was understood very, very explicitly as the understanding that emptiness is the absence of inherent existence. The view becomes your access, your relationship to what is true. Now, the term perspective, it's a word that's only recently been used in English for the last couple of hundred years. And its original meaning was an optical instrument, a telescope, a microscope. What it points to is how a perspective, like a microscope, somehow frames a particular dimension or aspect of what you're seeing that then gives you, as it were, the context within which you pursue your inquiries. So a perspective is something that gives you an orientation, and I would argue that the perspective of the Dharma is an orientation rather than a set of beliefs. And if we go back to the early texts, we'll find actually the Buddha gives a number of different explanations of what this perspective entails, but two of them in particular I think are worth noting. One is that this is a perspective that is non-binary, a perspective that's not locked into seeing things in terms of opposites, of this and that, of being and not being, of is and is not, right and wrong, as though the world corresponded to the rules of language and grammar and neatly broke things up into A and B. And that then provides, the right view as opposed to the wrong view. So the Buddha warned us when talking of this perspective as one that is somehow no longer caught up in those hard binary distinctions. When we look at a discourse in the middle-length sayings, which is actually called the Discourse on Right View, it talks of samma ditthi as a matter of being able to discern or differentiate between what is skillful and unskillful. It's got nothing to do with truth claims about the nature of reality at all. It has to do with the foundations of how we live morally and ethically in the world, how we make judgments and choices about how to proceed. That's not sufficient. It doesn't tell you what to do. It only gives you a framework. And the function of the imagination is to fill in and flesh out this framework. The imagination deals with very specific, concrete, and highly unstable, contingent, real-life situations on Earth. So what we're doing in moving from our perspective to the imagination is we're moving from the abstract to the concrete. Imagination provides us with the capacity, and it's an inbuilt human capacity, to imagine, in the first instance, an appropriate response, a judgment, something we say, something we do, that is in accord with the underlying values. Let's assume I believe all of these things, I hold all of these principles and values, but how do I convert that faith, as it were, into words and deeds that will have an impact on the specific world of my relationships with other people, my relationships with my society, my relationships with the planet? How do I translate those principles into acts? And I think without the imagination, we wouldn't even be able to begin to do that. Imagination is our capacity to picture to ourselves things that are not actually physically present. It might be an object, it might be a person, it might be an idea. If, let's say, we're having a problem with a friend, a lot of our time will be spent when we're alone imagining to ourselves what we're going to say, what we're going to do, how we're going to deal with something that's come up between my friend and myself. You know, he said or she said this to me, and that really was very painful and hurtful. How can I best deal in responding to that situation? And we can think of many alternatives. We stage them, as it were, in our minds. We also imagine what the consequences of saying this or doing that will have. Well, if I say this, then that person will feel this way, and that might mean that they will do this or do that. And I'm sure that we're all entirely familiar with what we're talking about here. This is such a crucial part of our humanity. A translation such as intention really fails to acknowledge what actually goes on in the conversion from abstract values into concrete words and deeds. Without imagination, it would also be impossible to imagine how another person might feel. And in that sense, imagination is necessary for us to experience empathy. Imagination is also, of course, central to the whole idea of creativity. The creative urge to resolve a problem, to come up with a creative solution. How do I solve this problem? How do I get this broken piece of machinery to work? How do I manage this organization? How do I find a satisfying conclusion to this piece of music? Creativity, again, can only operate if we have the capacity to imagine solutions and to abstractly play them out to see whether they might work. It's creativity which is often one of the things that, you know, makes us feel most alive. It's here, I think, we have to say a few words about how thinking can sometimes be seen not as a way of solving problems creatively, but a way of filling up our minds with ideas and thoughts that are actually getting in the way. So we need to make, I think, a very clear distinction between thinking as something we do consciously and deliberately with a particular aim or focus in mind, as opposed to the kind of anxious, distracted chatter, the monologue that, whether we like it or not, just keeps interrupting our presence of mind. And we notice this very, very clearly in meditation, because we sit down to meditate. We've got all of these ideas that we're going to focus on. We're going to do a meditation on loving kindness, let's say. But rather than do that, you find the mind just gets filled up with all kinds of undesired and not particularly interesting thoughts and ideas and trains of thought and fantasies and memories, all of which are, again, a function of our imagination, a function of our thinking, but at this particular point are no longer serving our purposes, but they're actually getting in the way. But we have to remember also that the Eightfold Path is not just about meditation, although in many Buddhist schools, meditation is given pride of place amongst the virtues. That's what's really going to get to the root of the problem. But the process of somehow then seeing thinking as a way of preventing us from getting to the root of our problem, I think has led to thinking being regarded as somehow suspect. But if you think about thinking as, let's say, we find it discussed by philosophers and others, then we can start talking of contemplative thinking. When I first started meditating with my Tibetan teachers, we didn't do any kind of vipassana-like mindfulness practices, just paying attention to our breath or to what's going on around us. But all of the meditations we did involved thinking, and they involved imagination. For example, I used to meditate for about 30 minutes a day on death. And again, death is not something that I can see. It's not present to me at that particular moment. So to think about death is to contemplate it in thought, in imagination, and to go through systematically the certainty of death. That's the one thing that is certain in the future. To contemplate the uncertainty of its time, that we could die at any moment. This is thinking, but it's thinking that is locked into certain explicit themes that we think are important, that we think we need to somehow get to grips with better. So contemplative thinking is intentional, it's focused, and it's also often hard work. It's not easy to keep that focus. It's not easy to keep a train of thought without getting distracted. Philosophers often complain about how thinking is so difficult, to think clearly, to think continuously. Yet this seems to be a very necessary part of any kind of contemplative practice. In some schools of Buddhism, like in the Tibetan tradition, it's much more explicit. But I think if you look at the early Pali materials too, you get the sense that the monks and the nuns and the lay people of that time too would have memorized certain lists of values and virtues and would have thought through them. They would remind themselves of these values now and again. And before we started doing these meditations on death, for example, we'd first of all say a few prayers, check our motivation, maybe do some breath exercises. So we get the mind relatively still, and then we begin. So the thinking process is, as it were, is evolving or developing in a still or a more still frame of mind, which allows us to be able to dwell more quietly on an idea and to learn how to think about things, to ponder, to reflect, that actually reveals how thinking can be an experience of considerable joy. And sankappa comes from the root verb kapeti, to create, to build, to construct, to arrange, to prepare, to order. It's about putting things into shape, organizing, configuring. It's crucial to the ways in which we configure ourselves, who we are, what it is that we aspire to be, how we wish to be seen by others, what kind of world we would like our children to grow up in. The literal word, sankappa, fits quite well as the English word imagination, far better than it does with the word intention. But in the end, so much of our imagining and our thinking are done in order for us to form intentions to act, which will mean, of course, commitments. We commit ourselves to say or do something that we recognize is going to have consequences. This is the point. Without that prior preparing of ourselves in our imagination, we may not really have thought through very clearly what the consequences will be of what we would like to say or like to do, because we feel that they've mistreated us in some way. We rarely think through, when we're feeling that way, how that's going to play out in terms of our relationship. It'll have consequences on how the other person feels, but it'll also have consequences on ourselves. After we've said this unpleasant thing to the person, we feel bad about that. We feel guilty, perhaps. We feel that we're letting another person down, and we feel that we really shouldn't have said that. We really shouldn't have done that. So imagination and thinking in this regard are very much trying to sort of expand and open up our field of inquiry, our field of ethical action, in such a way that we can keep in mind the bigger picture and can help us perhaps get a better sense of the impact of what we're going to do in the world itself.